École des Arts du Rhin estudia los vínculos entre arte, conocimiento y tecnología a través de las representaciones del cuerpo humano, desde lo idealizado a lo caricaturesco, lo grotesco y lo monstruoso. Ha comisariado diferentes exposiciones, por ejemplo, L'Art de la Grimace, 5 siècles d'excès de visage, de 2011. Otra publicación es Visage, son et représentation en Occident, de 2015. También Monstre, créature étrange et fantastique, de 2018. Y en colaboración con Laurent Baridon, con otro de nuestros ponentes, está una obra importante que es L'Art et l'Histoire de la Caricature, de 2006, que ha sido reeditado varias veces, ahora está la cuarta edición. Pues muchas gracias y vous pouvez commencer.
Merci. Okay. Merci beaucoup Paola pour l'organisation de ces journées, pour cette présentation. Donc je vais aussi parler en français. Vous voudrez bien m'en excuser, et comme l'a fait mon collègue Laurent Baridon, il y aura les petits extraits en espagnol qui ont été traduits très aimablement par Paola. Alors, dans le cadre de nos échanges sur Goya, ou plutôt autour de Goya et du grotesque, j'ai souhaité, comme l'indique le titre de ma communication, aborder la question, ou peut-être le problème, des représentations satiriques du son, de la musique et du sonore, de l'univers sonore, et plus précisément des sonorités désagréables, en me posant la question de savoir est-ce qu'il existe un équivalent visuel de ce que serait le grotesque au niveau sonore. Ce qui veut dire, a priori, s'intéresser aux représentations de chanteurs grimaçants, braillards, en essayant de voir par quels moyens graphiques, par quels traits, les discordances, les distorsions sonores sont évoquées par les artistes satiriques, à quoi elles sont associées, quelle filiation on trouve, et s'il est possible de repérer pour ce motif particulier des discordances sonores un héritage graphique dont Goya aurait bénéficié. Comme Laurent Baridon, je ne suis pas spécialiste de Goya, mais comme je travaille sur une période chronologique qui se situe à la charnière du XVIIIe et du XIXe siècle, et autour des représentations du corps grotesque et monstrueux, évidemment, c'est un artiste que j'ai souvent croisé, et c'est à cet égard que je me permets de l'évoquer aujourd'hui. Alors, dans le cadre de cette intervention, mon propos n'est pas nécessairement d'étudier le motif des distorsions grotesques chez Goya, mais plutôt de montrer que ce thème est bien présent dans son œuvre, et qu'il est souvent associé chez lui à des explorations du grotesque, dans une tonalité, dans un registre souvent inquiétant. Ça, c'est une chose. Et puis, la deuxième chose, et ça a déjà été évoqué lors des quatre interventions de ce matin, je vais m'interroger sur les filiations, sur la culture visuelle de Goya. Qu'est-ce qu'il a pu voir, ou peut-être ne pas voir, mais avec quel motif est-ce qu'il était familier, et qui peuvent se rattacher à cette thématique. Avec quel motif pouvait-il être familier, ne serait-ce que parce qu'il pratiquait la gravure, parce qu'il connaissait de nombreuses planches gravées, et on l'a vu qu'il pouvait s'en inspirer, les assimiler, les réinvestir différemment. Donc je vais procéder en partant de quelques exemples qui, pour ma part, me semblent significatifs chez Goya, et puis vous me direz en tant que spécialiste si je me trompe complètement, pour ensuite remonter vers des filiations possibles, filiations directes ou indirectes, comment ces motifs ont été diversement traités avant lui. Le premier exemple que j'ai choisi de retenir, et qui est à mon sens tout à fait éloquent, est tiré de l'album B, dans lequel on sait que Goya compose des scènes qu'il numérote et qu'il associe à des légendes dans un esprit de satire morale et sociale servi par un graphisme agressif, un graphisme mordant. Et on a parlé, à propos de cet album, d'un véritable tournant thématique et graphique chez lui, avec l'apparition des masques, avec l'apparition de la caricature et plus généralement avec l'émergence de l'irrationnel qui va peu à peu imprégner son œuvre, enfin une grande partie de son œuvre, à partir de ces années-là. Et très nettement, on voit dans cet exemple comment Goya assimile certains chanteurs à des physionomies bestialisées, à des types physiques bestialisés. Donc vous voyez que ça entre tout à fait en résonance avec ce qui nous a été dit ce matin dans les rapprochements qui ont été effectués avec les traités de Giambattista della Porta ou de Charles Lebrun, des gravures d'après les dessins de Charles Lebrun. Ici, dans un registre non pas sérieux comme chez Lebrun, mais dans un registre grotesque avec des nez aplatis, avec des bouches béantes, que l'on peut rapprocher de certains dessins qui se trouvent dans les caricatures italiennes. Alors ce matin, on nous a montré des caricatures de Ghezzi, un caricaturiste romain qui est souvent considéré comme le premier caricaturiste professionnel. Mais je pense aussi, vu la culture visuelle de Goya, aux caricaturistes vénitiens, dont je reparlerai dans un instant, comme Giambattista Tiepolo et Carlo Marchionni. Il est d'ailleurs intéressant de comparer les deux feuilles dans lesquelles ce même thème du petit concert privé apparaît au sein de cet album, avec, dans la première occurrence, un couple élégant dans un salon sans doute du XVIIIe siècle qui se livre à un duo. Et dans la feuille qui porte le numéro 27, qui est donc situé bien avant la 65, une femme au piano ou au clavecin, et derrière elle, un jeune petit maître à la française qui se penche par-dessus son épaule et qui suit des yeux la partition en chantant. Et donc, ce même motif inversé, puisque là nous avons l'homme au piano et la femme derrière, mais accompagné de deux autres chanteurs, donc un motif sans être tout à fait identique, mais très proche, se retrouve plusieurs feuilles plus loin, au numéro 65, mais cette fois-ci dans un registre, dans une tonalité différente, tout à fait grotesque, avec ces fameux visages animalisés, rendus au moyen d'effets graphiques qui anticipent déjà ceux qu'on va trouver plus tard dans les caprices, à savoir une association de coups de pinceau rapides, un fond quasiment monochrome qui sera traité à l'aquatinte, et donc ces effets graphiques franchement grotesques. Quelques années plus tard, au commencement du XIXe siècle, le thème de la musique et du chant, associé à des créatures grotesques et inquiétantes, comme s'il y avait toujours chez Goya, ce qui me semble le plus intéressant, c'est la convergence entre le rire et la peur. La musique le chant, les vocalises, les sons associés à des créatures stupides, dangereuses, voire dans certains dessins maléfiques. Un thème qui n'est pas tout à fait obsédant chez Goya. Je ne veux pas dire que c'est un thème qui revient tout le temps chez lui, mais qui se manifeste tout de même épisodiquement, régulièrement, surtout à travers ses dessins, comme ici avec cette sorcière en costume de gitane qui joue de la guitare tout en flottant dans les airs, ou encore une feuille ici de l'album album à la bordure noire, album E, qui présente un couple d'aveugles. Et on sait que les aveugles sont assez fréquents chez Goya, et le motif du musicien ou du guitariste aveugle, on va le retrouver par la suite, y compris dans les peintures noires. Mais c'est un motif qui ne vient pas comme ça de nulle part. Le thème, le motif des musiciens aveugles se retrouve par exemple avec des connotations moralisatrices dans l'estampes septentrionales, dans les gravures des Pays-Bas au siècle précédent. Vous voyez par exemple, un autre exemple, c'est les musiciens ambulants de Gaetano Zompini. Et donc là, on est plutôt dans une tradition italienne. C'est pour vous montrer que les musiciens aveugles qui sont issus du peuple, on les trouve dans la gravure septentrionale, on les trouve en Allemagne, on les trouve en Italie. Donc c'est pas un thème qui appartient en propre à Goya, mais c'est un thème qu'il réinvestit. Là, avec Gaetano Zompini, c'est un recueil qui a été publié à Venise sous le titre « Le arti che vanno per via nella città di Venezia ». Et c'est un ensemble qui se situe dans la tradition des cris. Il y a eu les cris de Bologne, les cris de Londres, les cris de Rome, les cris de Paris, etc. Et qui montrent finalement, ces ensembles montrent des représentants des petits métiers ambulants, en train de déambuler dans les rues, ici dans les rues de Venise, et qui, pour se faire remarquer, pour se faire un peu d'argent, mendient et se produisent en spectacle. Pour revenir rapidement aux deux planches de Goya, on remarquera aussi éventuellement au passage que plusieurs sens sont évoqués. L'odorat, avec la femme qui se bouche le nez juste en dessous de la sorcière, le toucher avec les doigts du guitariste, la vue, ou plutôt l'absence de vue avec les aveugles, et l'ouïe par le son, mais l'ouïe que Goya avait bien sûr perdu en 1793, si je me souviens bien. Et on sait que pour lui, la musique jouait un rôle important, que ce soit d'ailleurs la musique savante. D'ailleurs, comme pour certains de ses mécènes, on sait qu'il avait été en contact, grâce à ses mécènes, avec des compositeurs et des compositions savantes, mais aussi, on peut supposer qu'il nourrissait un intérêt pour la musique populaire, dont l'Espagne était fervente, puisqu'on a toutes sortes de représentations de chanteurs, de danseuses qui s'accompagnent au tambourin ou aux castagnettes, etc. La question qu'on peut se poser, c'est est-ce que sa surdité ne l'a pas entraîné finalement vers un univers sonore plus violent, qui va plus vers le vacarme. Et ça, on le voit à travers des planches gravées et des dessins qui mettent en scène, que ce soit dans la tauromachie, que ce soit dans les caprices ou dans les disparates, qui mettent en scène des bruits, des cris, des meuglements de taureaux, les cris de la foule, et puis dans les désastres de la guerre, les cris de souffrance, les cris des soldats, les bruits des canons, des fusils, le cliquetis des armes, etc. Et on peut ajouter à cela des titres, des sous-titres, qui très souvent font référence au bruit, aux cris et aux sons. Alors, ce n'est pas mon propos, je ne suis pas parti dans une étude systématique sur ce motif chez Goya, mais simplement, je pense qu'en fouillant un peu plus que je ne l'ai fait pour le moment, on pourrait multiplier les exemples et repérer plus systématiquement encore les musiciens, les chanteurs, parfois accompagnés de danseurs ou de danseuses, aux expressions grotesques, voire vaguement inquiétantes, que Goya a multipliées dans ses compositions graphiques, dessins, gravures et même parfois peintures, avec des moines qui bêlent leurs cantiques, avec des villageois échauffés par l'alcool et les festivités populaires, avec des vieillards excités par les rythmes de la danse, etc., etc. Mais ce qui m'intéresse à présent, c'est de montrer en quoi Goya, à travers cette iconographie, s'approprie et enrichit une thématique apparue dès les débuts de la satire graphique imprimée, c'est-à-dire à partir de la Renaissance. Quelle thématique ? J'y reviens. Une thématique qui évoque l'univers des chansons à boire, des chanteurs de rue, des musiciens pauvres et ambulants et des petits concerts privés. Et ce qui m'intéresse, c'est bien sûr le fait que ces dessins ou ces gravures peuvent à la fois refléter des pratiques communes observées par Goya et par d'autres artistes avant lui, mais en même temps avoir un contenu allégorique. Ça, c'est une chose, c'est un angle d'approche possible pour ce répertoire. Cela dit, et je m'inscrirai dans le prolongement des interventions de ce matin à cet égard, ce sont aussi et surtout les dispositifs et les codes corporels au moyen desquels Goya et avant lui d'autres dessinateurs et d'autres graveurs dont il procède en partie, se sont efforcés d'objectiver les sons et d'objectiver surtout les dissonances, tout en stigmatisant, tout en dénonçant ou en critiquant ceux qui émettent ces sons désagréables, et cela en fonction d'échelles de valeurs qui sont aussi souvent des échelles de distinction sociale. Alors je vais essayer d'illustrer ce propos par des exemples, disons, contrastés. En d'autres termes, il me semble que l'on peut situer les dessins de Goya par rapport à ce système de représentation en lien avec les règles qui s'éditent depuis le XVIe, XVIIe et qui continuent avec les Ilustrados au XVIIIe siècle, avec les règles de bonne mesure, les règles de contenance, les règles de maintien corporel et de maîtrise de la voix et des sons. Autrement dit, si l'on se réfère à ces manuels de savoir-vivre, à ces manuels de politesse, aux règles de la maîtrise des passions, chanter à gorge déployée, beugler, s'égosiller, émettre des sons stridents ou nasillards ou tonnants, tout cela relève de l'exubérance des sens, des désordres du corps, et donc il n'est pas étonnant que ces manifestations sonores ait été exploité dans le registre du grotesque et de la satire sociale. Inversement, rappelons-nous les mots de Sancho Panza à l'égard de la duchesse à l'entrée de la forêt, quand il dit « La musique ne peut pas être mauvaise ». Quand la duchesse est inquiète, Sancho lui dit « La musique ne peut pas être mauvaise ». Mais quelle musique? La musique savante, la musique maîtrisée, celle que tous les prescripteurs du bon goût, celle que tous les auteurs qui s'intéressent au maintien, aux règles de la cour, aux règles de politesse, vont encourager, parce que cette maîtrise des sons et de la musique est comme une éducation du corps et indirectement aussi de l'esprit. Alors maintenant, la caricature, d'abord en Italie et en Angleterre, n'a pas traité que de la musique populaire. La caricature n'a pas épargné le monde de la musique savante. Et c'est tant mieux, parce que ça nous permet de faire des comparaisons et des juxtapositions qui peuvent être, stimulantes, fécondes. Ainsi, l'univers des chanteurs d'opéra, des musiciens professionnels, et pour le XVIIIe siècle, parce qu'il faut se rapprocher quand même un peu de Goya pour voir quelles sont les transitions qui se sont effectuées, j'y reviens, donc c'est notamment le cas à Venise. À Venise, où nous avons cet extraordinaire caricaturiste, Antonio Maria Zanetti, une personnalité aux multiples talents, puisqu'il fut à la fois critique d'art, collectionneur, marchand d'art, graveur, et aussi un des caricaturistes, à mon avis, les plus inventifs du XVIIIe siècle, en tout cas un des caricaturistes italiens les plus inventifs du XVIIIe siècle, avec des personnages imaginaires ou réels, ou imaginaires et réels, qui, comme c'est le cas ici, sont saisis avec un trait épuré, faussement naïf, qui faussement rappelle le graffiti ou le dessin d'enfant, mais d'une invention formelle tout à fait étonnante. Donc ici, cette planche représente un castrat, Antonio Bernacchi, dans le rôle de Mitridate, re di Ponto. Un castrat au moment où son chant s'élève de plus en plus haut sur Venise, au-dessus de Venise, dans une sorte d'arabesque rococo, s'élève dans tous les sens du terme, plus haut encore que le campanile de San Marco, pour redescendre ensuite en direction de la Biblioteca Marciana. Bon, je passe sur le rôle de Bernacchi dans cet opéra. On le voit simplement ici, de profil, la main sur la poitrine. C'est un opéra qui avait été créé à Venise en 1723, ce qui explique peut-être l'actualité aussi de cette caricature. Mais ce qui m'intéresse, ce sont les moyens graphiques employés par Zanetti afin de transposer visuellement ce chant mélodieux, ce chant enchanteur, suraigu, qui s'échappe de la bouche de son personnage, avec ces espèces d'idéogrammes, chant raffiné, chant virtuose, assorti d'ornements et de trilles. Une arabesque rococo qui évoque une portée musicale qui s'élève, qui redescend, évoquant aussi la mélodie. Et le premier point que je retiendrai, c'est donc l'emploi d'idéogrammes. Ces idéogrammes que l'on va retrouver ensuite assez souvent pour évoquer les sons, pour évoquer les bruits, pour objectiver le son au moyen de codages qui peuvent suggérer la hauteur, qui peuvent suggérer la longueur du son. Tout cela, évidemment, remarquable. On pourrait aussi se demander si cette arabesque ne figure pas une sorte de visage grotesque ou caricatural dans le ciel, parce que nous savons qu'en Italie, il existe des jeux graphiques qui sont pratiqués par les caricaturistes et qui tracent comme ça des visages de profil le plus souvent à l'aide de signes. Bon, ce n'est pas un point que je souhaite développer ici, mais il faut l'avoir peut-être en réserve dans son esprit. Simplement, l'idée d'évoquer la légèreté du chant par des arabesques plus ou moins subtiles, on la retrouve, cette idée, chez un des plus grands caricaturistes du XVIIIe siècle, si ce n'est un des plus grands caricaturistes de tous les temps, James Gillray, quand il immortalise à sa manière un autre morceau de bravoure sonore, celui de Mrs. Billington à Covent Garden en 1801, dans le rôle de Mandane, dans l'opéra de Thomas Arne qui s'appelle Artaxerces. Et là, il représente donc la cantatrice dans ce même geste, avec la main sur la poitrine, se pressant ici la poitrine avantageuse, comme pour expulser le souffle, comme pour expulser le chant matérialisé sous la forme d'un phylactère qui s'échappe de cette bouche grande ouverte. Le deuxième point, donc premier point, c'était les signes qui transposent visuellement le sonore. Le deuxième point que je voudrais évoquer, c'est le rapport du personnage qui émet le son à l'espace qui l'entoure. En effet, dans le cas de Zanetti, c'est un espace urbain qui peut signifier, comme je l'ai dit, que Venise est sous l'emprise et sous l'enchantement de Bernacchi. Mais cette association du chanteur avec l'espace urbain signifie aussi, ou suggère aussi, enfin, il me semble, qu'à cette date, l'opéra n'est pas encore coupé de la culture populaire, comme on le verra par la suite à partir du XIXe siècle. Que ce soit d'ailleurs à Venise, à Rome, à Naples ou même à Paris où au XVIIIe siècle, de nombreux airs fameux continuent d'être chantés comme des refrains populaires sur le Pont-Neuf, également fréquenté le Pont-Neuf par des musiciens itinérants. Donc il n'y a pas encore ce clivage entre l'opéra qui serait réservé à une élite et un opéra qui pourrait peut-être enchanter la cité tout entière. Mais c'est bien, comme l'indique le titre de mon intervention, c'est bien le chant du peuple que je voudrais interroger maintenant, la spécificité supposée, la spécificité prêtée au chant du peuple que je vais essayer de montrer le plus rapidement possible, parce qu'elle se donne à voir à travers d'autres effets visuels que celui des idéogrammes. Peut-être parce que cette musique n'est plus une musique écrite, ou n'est pas une musique écrite aussi savamment. Ça ne veut pas dire qu'on ne verra pas des partitions, mais on verra autre chose. Avant cela, encore un point sur cette caricature, un point qui va me servir de transition avec ce qui va suivre. On sait bien que la caricature, et le grotesque aussi, c'est leur point commun, s'exprime souvent à travers le corps humain qui sort des normes habituelles. Et ici, ce castrat sort des normes habituelles déjà par le fait qu'il produit ce son éblouissant en raison d'une opération qu'il a subie. Et puis ce castrat est doté d'un corps imposant qui contraste, ce corps imposant qui contraste avec la légèreté de ce chant. Un peu comme chez Gilray d'ailleurs. Cela dit, il ne me semble pas que le dessin en question veut entièrement le ridiculiser. Dire, ce n'est pas un dessin offensif. On est peut-être dans le registre du grotesque, mais ce personnage reste élégant malgré sa silhouette de gros scarabée avec ses petites pattes écartées, un peu comme Charlie Chaplin. Son visage reste subtilement évoqué. Il n'y a rien d'offensant, je trouve, dans la manière dont il est représenté. En tout cas, il reste raffiné, et c'est bien cela la gageure que réussit Zanetti. Il reste raffiné malgré son embonpoint, malgré le caractère un peu ridicule de son costume. Et si j'ai tant insisté là-dessus, c'est que le contraste me semble éloquent avec ce que l'on trouve dans les représentations du chant du peuple. On a là, en effet, une gravure qui a été exécutée à peu près dans les mêmes années, vers 1720, donc premier tiers du XVIIIe siècle, et qui montre cette fois un chanteur populaire. Un chanteur de nuit en action avec sa lanterne magique sur le dos. Alors, il n'est pas indispensable à mon propos d'entrer dans les détails du commentaire de cette planche. Il faut simplement savoir que ce personnage-là est issu d'un d'un recueil qui a été édité à Augsbourg au début du XVIIIe siècle et qui est un recueil de nains grotesques. Et le titre de ce recueil, c'est Il Calotto Resuscitato, le Jacques Callot ressuscité, en référence à la tradition des nains bossus, les gobi de Jacques Callot, mais c'est juste le titre qui fait référence à Jacques Callot parce que les nains qui figurent dans ce recueil n'ont rien à voir avec ceux de Jacques Callot. Et ensuite, ce traité a connu une diffusion incroyable, a été remanié en Allemagne, en France, en Italie, aux Pays-Bas. Il me paraît peu probable que Goya ait ignoré ces planches qui étaient disponibles soit à la feuille, soit en recueil. Il y a eu des copies, il y a eu des pastiches, etc. Bien, je ferme la parenthèse. Ici, le personnage du nain est utilisé dans un contexte politique, dans une suite de gravures qui, ici, est imprimée dans les Pays-Bas. Et en fait, pour aller vite, ces gravures dénoncent les spéculations désastreuses autour des compagnies des mers du Sud et du Mississippi en 1719-1720, ce qu'on a appelé la bulle du Mississippi, Mississippi Bubble. Et donc là, également sur un format vertical, la composition montre un homme, cette fois à l'aspect repoussant, qui avance vers la droite de 3/4, portant un bâton surmonté d'un moulin à vent. Le moulin à vent, les lecteurs du Quichotte savent que c'est souvent un symbole de folie aussi. Et sur ses épaules, donc une lanterne magique. Il est coiffé d'un chapeau à large bord avec une plume de coq coincée. Et il semble hurler à tue-tête, la bouche largement ouverte, découvrant les dents et l'aluette et la langue. Quelle est la chanson ? La chanson est dédié à son appareil optique. La chanson se rapporte à la lanterne magique et il explique que la mode des lanternes magiques a été lancée au pays des coqs, Gallus, autrement dit en France. Et au-dessous de l'image, les vers en néerlandais expliquent en rime que le personnage s'emploie à pleurer, à gueuler, à bâiller, à brailler, à montrer les dents, à faire beaucoup de bruit, mais attention, pas une allusion à l'affaire de la Mississippi Bubble. Chut, sur la Mississippi Bubble, on se tait. Donc un dispositif, vous voyez, assez simple, qui pourtant ne surgit pas de nulle part. Le fait de montrer un personnage qui hurle et qui se promène dans un endroit à peu près désert, donc on se demande, mais pour qui est-ce qu'il hurle? Pour qui est-ce qu'il chante? Pour qui est-ce qu'il braille? Il est solitaire, il est dans la campagne, il est seul, ce qui contraste quand même avec le castrat de Zanetti, dont le chant exerce une emprise sur toute la population vénitienne. Cette tradition-là ne vient pas de n'importe où, elle vient, comme je l'ai déjà dit, de la tradition des représentations des crieurs aux physionomies caricaturales. On retrouve ainsi, pardon, j'ai oublié un détail, c'est bien sûr le vêtement rapiécé, troué, qui s'oppose à l'élégance du castrat. Donc cette typologie, on la trouve dans les images de crieurs aux physionomies caricaturales, aux vêtements rapiécés, que l'on imprime à Paris chez Jacques Lanier ou qu'on imprime en Italie avec des graveurs comme Ambrogio Brambilla, Francesco Villamena, avec son fameux Geminiano Calda Rostaro, qui montre un vendeur de marron chaud et qui appartient donc à une série de gravures au burin dédiées aux cris de Rome. Dans ce registre-là, dont le caractère franchement grotesque est éventuellement là aussi renforcé par l'ajout d'une légende ou d'un quatrain trivial, ce sont les représentants des petits métiers ambulants qui émettent des sonorités qui relèvent du corps grotesque, du corps trivial. Et cela peut en partie s'expliquer par le fait que ces vendeurs ambulants étaient bien entendu dans l'obligation de se faire entendre, d'attirer la curiosité des passants, des curieux, des voyageurs, quitte pour cela à se vêtir aussi d'étranges costumes, ce curieux bonnet pointu, et d'instruments, rudimentaires pour accompagner les sonorités de leur voix. Plus spécifiquement, à propos de cette planche, il faut souligner que le caractère grotesque du personnage ne se retrouve pas dans les autres gravures du recueil et que le texte de la légende, en dessous, décrit la puissance vocale du personnage qui, nous explique-t-on, est capable de secouer Pluton lui-même dans ses abîmes. Donc, une voix infernale, une voix terrifiante et peut-être que les nuages qui s'amoncellent ici et qui vont sans doute faire tomber la pluie, voire la grêle, voire les éclairs, sont une participation du paysage et une réaction du ciel à cette voix infernale. Bien entendu, la jonction qui s'opère entre un son mal maîtrisé et le corps grotesque qui en est à l'origine ne se limite pas aux représentations des métiers ambulants. Donc là, on a des métiers ambulants, mais le corps grotesque qui émet des sons grotesques, on en trouve aussi dans toute la tradition qui relève de l'iconographie des chansons bachiques, comme dans cette gravure sur bois parisienne, issue de la production du quartier de la rue Montorgueil. Cette fois, une composition centrée sur cet enfant vu de face, et qui tient son livre de musique ouvert, et tout autour de lui, des personnages grotesques, voire franchement monstrueux, qui ont tous la bouche ouverte et qui sont tous associés aux victuailles, au vin, à la consommation d'alcool, de jambon, de pain. Donc finalement, je suis assez content de vous montrer cette image juste après le repas de midi, où nous aurions pu chanter, mais nous ne l'avons pas fait, c'est peut-être que partie remise. Nous avons des exemples, en tout cas, pour savoir comment nous comporter de façon malséante et grotesque, brandir des jambons, boire et être costumé avec des signes allégoriques qui peuvent évoquer l'abondance, mais qui peuvent aussi évoquer le pèlerinage. La coquille de Saint-Jacques de Compostelle, et on sait bien que l'image satirique, l'image, même la caricature imprimée, s'en prend parfois aux pèlerins en invitant le lecteur, ou plutôt le spectateur, à se méfier de ces personnages itinérants, de ces pèlerins qui vont d'auberge en auberge et qui ne sont peut-être pas exactement ce que leur habit nous dit qu'ils sont. Peut-être se cache parfois une créature diabolique ou monstrueuse derrière un habit qui devrait être plutôt rassurant. Mais là, ce sont des habits qui s'apparentent à la fois aux pèlerins, aux bouffons, et puis les visages des convives sont franchement monstrueux, sont franchement grotesques. Il faut voir aussi que c'est une variation sur le thème à la fois du concert, sur le thème du banquet, dont il existe des versions beaucoup plus sérieuses en peinture, par exemple chez Giorgione ou Veronese, Giorgione et Veronese qui, eux, donnent des concerts avec des nobles musiciens. Donc on a là une sorte d'inversion carnavalesque du concert raffiné, du concert maîtrisé, un retournement finalement du côté du monstrueux, du côté du grotesque. Et un autre point qu'il me semble intéressant de relever, c'est comment le cri, le bruit et l'ivresse et le vin se mêlent, se mélangent. Et comment le cri et l'ivresse sont traduits graphiquement par des bouches franchement bestiales, mais aussi par des sourcils qui se végétalisent, comme des mascarons, gothiques ou même renaissants. Des étranges formations végétales au niveau des sourcils, des lèvres qui se gonflent et qui deviennent comme des orifices obscènes, d'où le chant va s'échapper comme une sorte de cri primal. Cette tradition, on voit qu'on la trouve en Italie, on voit qu'on la trouve dans les Pays-Bas, on voit qu'on la trouve en France. D'autres images de chanteurs bachiques, liés à Bacchus, sont ceux, par exemple, d'autres chanteurs bachiques sont ceux gravés d'après Jan Verbeek et qui confirment certaines de ces solutions graphiques avec l'association toujours de partitions et de textes qui viennent commenter ou qui entrent en écho avec ce que la physionomie, les corps nous disent. Et vous voyez bien qu'on retrouve à la fois des bouffons, des sorcières, des gens qui sont malades à force d'avoir bu, et tout ça associé à des individus qui sont certes bouffons, qui sont certes en joyeuse compagnie, qui sont rassemblés autour d'une table, sans doute dans une auberge, mais qui boivent, qui mangent, qui chantent de façon excessive, de façon immodérée, de façon incontrôlée. C'est le registre de la culture du ventre et de la gueule, c'est le registre de la boisson, des dépenses inconsidérées, en tout cas pour une classe sociale qui est clairement modeste, et une classe sociale qui, en raison de sa modestie, est associée par les graveurs et par ceux qui leur achètent leurs planches à toutes sortes de stéréotypes sur les mauvaises manières des paysans, sur l'emprise de la gourmandise, sur l'emprise de la rapacité, sur ces classes sociales. Alors comme ça, on pourrait continuer. On trouve depuis la fin du XVIe siècle jusqu'à la fin depuis le XVIe siècle jusqu'à la fin du XVIIIe siècle, toute une tradition de représentation, de concerts grotesques, de chansons à boire, un peu partout en Europe, parfois associés avec le monde des nains. L'univers des nains, des concerts de nains, qui peuvent être là aussi moralisés, plutôt dans les Pays-Bas et plutôt d'un esprit bouffon en Italie. Je pense bien sûr que Goya en avait connaissance. Je ne sais pas comment on le dit en espagnol, la planche Les Petits Lutins. La planche des caprices, les petits lutins, où on voit un prêtre avec une main énorme. Bon, c'est pas grave. Donc c'est la tradition des Gobi, des Caramogi, chez Jacques Callot, chez Stefano della Bella, chez Valerio Spada, que Goya connaissait. Ce sont des planches à l'eau fort, des planches gravées qui circulaient un peu partout en Europe. Cela dit, je voudrais terminer cet aperçu avec un dernier exemple. Une gravure dont il existe une version peinte qui représente cette fois deux chanteurs mendiants, tout à fait caractéristiques de la pauvreté aux Pays-Bas à cette période. Deux vieillards qui marchent dans un espace, là encore, plus ou moins désertique. On imagine qu'il y a un village pas loin, mais enfin, ils sont quand même en rase campagne. Ils marchent en faisant de la musique. Lui, un homme barbu, unijambiste, avec une vielle à roue. On peut aussi penser à la tradition des aveugles associés aux vielles à roue. Et puis elle, bossue comme la typologie de la sorcière, avec ses bésicles sur le nez, qui essaye de lire et de chanter péniblement la partition. Tout ça qui me semble aller de pair avec la représentation de Francesco Villamena, parce que dans les deux cas, bon, je vous montre l'image en gros plan ici, dans les deux cas, leur chant amène des nuages. Le ciel s'obscurcit. Dans les deux cas, les dissonances vont avoir un écho, si je puis dire, dans la nature, par la réaction du ciel. Ce n'est pas, bien sûr, le seul lien avec la tradition à laquelle se rattache la planche gravée de Villamena. Nous avons, dans les deux cas, des personnages marqués par une aura dépréciative, cette aura dépréciative qui frappe généralement les représentants du peuple, les représentants des métiers itinérants, les nomades, l'univers sonore des parades de foire, les cris des métiers. Dans un registre de représentation, vous l'avez bien compris, où on est toujours entre le burlesque et l'inquiétant. L'inquiétant n'est jamais loin, avec des visages aux traits accusés, avec des comportements scabreux, excessifs, traduction à la fois d'une peur sociale, d'un sentiment d'étrangeté, de préjugés, qui conduisent à relier systématiquement le peuple aux cris, aux braillements, aux bruits, aux passions débordantes. Et comme on sait que jusqu'à la fin du XVIIIe siècle, au moins, le cri est considéré comme la voix naturelle des passions, mais des passions dans le sens pathologique du terme, il s'ensuit que, comme je le disais pour commencer, le contrôle de la voix, un peu comme le contrôle des gestes corporels et des mimiques, est préconisé dans les manuels de civilité. Pour terminer, je pense que globalement, les images que je vous ai montrées reflètent à leur manière, à travers une sorte d'exotisme social ou de déréalisation, ce regard sur les attitudes, sur les conduites sonores, regard qui a priori, oppose son grotesque, déplacé, vulgaire, gueulard des catégories sociales modestes et son maîtrisé, raffiné, harmonieux des gens instruits et polissés. Même si ces gens instruits et polissés, même si ces chanteurs raffinés ne sont pas forcément épargnés par les caricaturistes et par la satire. Mais, et ce sera mon dernier mot, il n'en reste pas moins que les moyens visuels mis en œuvre à travers ces différentes images suggèrent, certes, une sorte de hiérarchie sociale du sonore, mais chez Goya, tout comme chez Hogarth, ces dissonances ne sont pas réservées aux catégories sociales inférieures ou jugées inférieures. Un peu comme chez Hogarth, Goya affecte aussi les classes favorisées de dissonances grotesques. Et l'on pourrait aussi constater, par exemple, à la fois une approche bienveillante de Goya vis-à-vis de la musique populaire dans les cartons des tapisseries, et inversement, une approche dissonante des classes sociales favorisées dans ces dessins grotesques et ces caricatures. Voilà.
Tomamos 2 minutos entre que instalamos el nuevo PowerPoint y continuamos. You sure? I can just plug this. No, it's okay. You sure? It'll be easier to see. Okay. Oh.
Thank you for bringing it. No, of course.
I need to put your presentation. ¿Lo de las colecciones? Sí. Ah, vale. Muy bien.
Where's mine?
Okay, that says reviewed. The one above it says final.
No, it's okay. It's the right one.
There's a-
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to embarrass you.
Reviewed by Paola. That's. Okay, thank you. Would you put this?
Sorry, thank you.
Okay, let's see.
Bueno, finalmente el último ponente de hoy, de la primera jornada de este seminario, se trata de Andrew Schultz. Andrew es un galardonado profesor y estudioso del arte español de los siglos XVIII y XIX. En la actualidad es vicepresidente de las Artes y decano de la Facultad de Bellas Artes en la Universidad de Arizona. Su trabajo ha aparecido en numerosas e importantes revistas, en volúmenes editados y catálogos de exposiciones. Su monografía Goya's Caprichos, Estética, Percepción y Cuerpo recibió el premio Eleanor Tufts de la Sociedad Americana de Estudios Históricos del Arte Hispano, que es un libro que yo he utilizado muchísimo. Entre sus proyectos actuales, Andrew está terminando un libro titulado Al-Andalus in the Age of Enlightenment, Islamic Art and Culture in the Spanish Imagination, bajo contrato con Penn State Press. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Paula, por esa introducción. Estoy encantado de participar en este seminario con mis estimados colegas y sobre todo con Janice Tomlinson, que fue mi asesora de tesis doctoral hace muchísimos años. Os ruego aceptéis mis disculpas por no presentar mi ponencia en español. Como veréis, voy a hacer una presentación muy visual, por lo que aunque no entendéis cada palabra, habrá imágenes interesantes que ver. So with that, I want to begin my talk with a brief introduction to the caprichos, which have circled around this entire day. I think they've been referred to or analyzed in each one of the talks. But I want to say a little bit more about this print series to provide a context for the 4 hand-colored sets of the caprichos that I'm going to examine. And I'll say at the outset, this is a talk very much about the physicality and the materiality of these works, which I think is something we think about too little when we think about the caprichos and we think about Goya in general. So as you know, on February 6, 1799, this notice appeared in a Madrid newspaper announcing the publication of una colección de estampas de asuntos caprichosos inventadas y grabadas a la fuerte por Don Francisco Goya. This collection soon became known as Caprichos de Goya, and these 80 aquatint etchings are one of the central monuments in the history of European art. In creating and publishing these works, Goya became part of a tradition of painter-etchers that began in the Renaissance and continued to his own day, and included Rembrandt, Tiepolo, and many others. And from Goya's time to the present, Los Caprichos have had a decisive influence on generations of artists, musicians, and writers. There is, of course, a very extensive bibliography on the Caprichos that examines Goya's sources, the subjects of the prints, their technical aspects, and their meaning for Goya's contemporaries and later viewers. And here I've just highlighted a few of what I think are kind of key characteristics that will help to frame some of what I'm going to talk about in my talk, this combination of satire and fantasy, the interaction of text and image, the openness of these prints to many interpretations or a range of interpretations, and finally, the inventive use of the materials and techniques of printmaking, and especially of aquatint. But above all, I think we can agree the most characteristic or important feature of these works, what makes them so remarkable, certainly as visual objects, is the remarkable use of light and dark, especially in early impressions. And this experience of light and dark, I would argue, is central to the experience and the meaning of the prints. It has been seen to take on a symbolic quality that's fundamental to the viewer's experience of these works, suggesting contrasts between good and evil, ignorance and enlightenment, mystery and clarity. So given the centrality of light and dark, black and white, to these images, it comes as a surprise, perhaps, to discover that there are hand-colored sets of the prints. And although there may have been more, there are at present 4 known sets of hand-colored caprichos. And I'm using the word in Spanish, iluminada, coloreada is another way of thinking about this. And it's thought that these sets were probably colored in the early years of the 19th century. I think a next step in learning more is going to be technical analysis of the materials, the pigments used, which hasn't been undertaken by any of the institutions that own these sets. You know, I think when we first encounter these impressions, it's probably easy to dismiss them as 4 kind of ruined sets of first edition caprichos. But I want to, and I would say that in some senses they have questionable artistic importance in their own rights. But I'm going to argue for the idea that these works do deserve our attention for a couple of reasons. And by the way, I'm obviously showing you this image from the MFA Boston. This is probably the set that, if people do know about the existence of these works, this is the one they probably know, and I'll talk about it probably in the most detail in the course of my my talk today. But I think some of the qualities I was just mentioning are present here. This elimination of the incredible contrast between light and dark, which is so central to the original work, with this illumination of the artist's body, the ring of animals that encircles him. All of that has been transformed into something quite different, and in some ways more anecdotal and maybe more pedestrian. So I think, you know, there are probably more than 2 reasons to think about the value of looking at these hand-colored caprichos, but I do think that, first of all, they do tell us something about how early viewers understood, made sense of, interacted with these works. They saw them as something to engage in this kind of remarkable way, which, as we'll see, also fits into a larger tradition of hand coloring. But I think the second thing, and this has certainly been true for me as I've started to dig into this project, the attention to understanding the coloring has refocused my attention on the prints and has revealed to me aspects of the original images that I had overlooked previously. And so I think that's also interesting to think about the way in which seeing these sets encourages us to see the original works in some ways with fresh eyes. So the hand-colored set in Boston, which I'm going to begin with, and then I'll circle around and talk about some of the other sets, and I'll then return to the Boston set at the end of my talk. It's certainly the most interesting of the four sets. It's definitely the most heavily worked. As I'll talk about later, the unknown artist who undertook this coloring of this set really thought about coloring the entire image. And you see that here, not only the figure, the chair, the outlining of the text, but also the entire background has been given a tone of watercolor. Just to talk about for a minute, I think it's interesting that one of the things this artist does is draw our attention to the text on the desk. He outlines it, or she outlines it, and underscores it. I think the coloring gives the image a greater sense of space. Again, I mentioned the elimination of the contrast in light and dark, and the ways in which the animals are also altered as well. So I had a chance, by the way, I should also mention I've had a chance over the last couple of months to examine each of these four sets in person, which has also been really interesting. These are some pictures I took in Boston last month in the print room there. Two of the sets are still bound. This is one of those, and the Boston set is really interesting and unusual in that it's bound in 2 volumes using this blue paper. These would be called paper wrappers. In English, this is a very traditional way of binding books in the 18th century, a kind of inexpensive approach to binding. You can also see that the colorist has created a title page, which none of the bound sets of the Capriccios from Goya's time included. So this is an interesting addition and intervention. And there's also handwritten text on the spine, which I'm not showing you, which suggests the work was shelved as well. Binding, of course, is not unique. There are several dozen sets of the Capriccios which have come down to us as bound. The most common binding from Goya's time or shortly after is what you see on the left. This is brown calf. In English, we would call it mottled calf, the pattern. You can see the gold tooling on the cover and this very common treatment on the spine, which says Capriccio de Goya. And then the image on the right is one of a very few, and I mentioned there are several dozen of this kind of approach, and some of them include working proofs or plates with mistakes in the captions. It may have been Goya included those intentionally for certain kind of collectors or as a kind of bonus for those who bought the edition. The binding on the right is a much less common binding. I know of 2 sets that are bound this way. This one, which came up at auction at Christie's in 2017, and the set in Boston at the Athenaeum is also bound this way. And that, just as a Goya trivia question, the Athenaeum set is the first work by Goya owned by an American collector or collection. It was purchased in 1830, which is remarkably early. And so these are probably presentation volumes. There's been speculation that this set may have been one of the ones purchased by the Duchess of Osuna in January 1799. We don't know that for sure, but the binding seems to have been made by the binder to the king. And so, there's an interesting history to that as well. And you can see that actually the spine has a different phrase written on it, which is Pensamiento de Goya. And I think these spines and these phrases deserve some attention that they haven't received yet. I'm not going to do that here. But one of the things I'm going to say is that part of what I've come to focus on more is the fact that the Capriccios were a book. That's how they would have been experienced in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and we so often see them as independent images, abstracted from the context of this kind of the physicality of the book. And in fact, they were understood that way by Goya's contemporaries. There's one reference from 1808 by a diplomat writing around the time of the Peninsular War, who describes the Capriccios as a book of English-style caricatures on Spanish subjects. I mentioned the Boston set is in 2 volumes, and that also is revealing. We tend to think, if we think about the Capriccios as divided in 2 parts, and we sometimes talk about them this way, we think about this as the division, that there's this frontispiece, if you will, the portrait of Goya, which we've seen several times today, and then Capriccio 43 as maybe initiating a second sequence of images, which focuses more on the fantastic. And of course, Capriccio 43 originated in a drawing, which was the frontispiece for the planned series of Sueños, which is the origin of the Capriccios. And so this kind of makes sense in some ways, but what's interesting is in the Boston set, the works are divided exactly in half. And so the first volume contains 40 Capriccios, and the second volume contains 40 Capriccios. And so volume 2 begins with the image you see on the right, and so it's a different kind of image of the painter or the artist, if you will. Not the image of the dreaming artist at the desk, but the image of the artist as a kind of servile, creator of portraits on commission. And so it's interesting to think about it in this slightly different way in terms of the organization and the structure of the images. Sticking with kind of the material examination of this set, there's a collector's mark on it, a partial collector's mark, which I've highlighted, a partial M, and it's hard to know what that is from that fragment, but there are some options in looking through. Fritz looked, his standard text on collector's marks, and one possibility is this artist Gustave Francois Morin, who was a 19th century painter, also a printmaker. And possibly he was the owner of this set. What we do know is that Eleanor Sayer owned this set, and I'm just showing you an image just to bring Eleanor to mind, a book that was referenced earlier today. Eleanor is one of the authors of this catalog in 1988-89 exhibition that was here in Madrid and also in New York, and was it somewhere else? I can't remember. Was it just those 2 venues? I can't remember. But anyway, it's interesting that, so Eleanor was actually an avid collector herself, and when she died in 2002, she donated some 200 works to the MFA, and she owned a number of other things. She owned a manuscript commentary, very important one, and lots of other things. And she included, you'll see this later, she included one of the images from this set of hand-colored Capriccios in her earlier exhibition, The Changing Image, from 1974. And I think that's the one and only time this set has been exhibited. I don't know that it's been exhibited since. The Boston set also is bound with a set of commentaries. This is also common among many sets of Capriccios. We now know, thanks to the work of Helmut Jacobs and his team, there are something like some 70 sets of commentaries, a handwritten set of explanations describing the meaning, if you will, of each work. And as I think most of you in this room, if not all, will know, these are an interesting source for understanding, again, early reactions to the prints. It's most likely that the earliest commentaries were written before 1803, when Goya donated the plates, and unsold sets to the crown. The explanation circulated with copies of the prints, and some of them are very general in tone. Some name specific individuals, like Manuel Godoy or the Duchess of Osuna. This particular manuscript, like many, is based on another manuscript. In this case, this text is based on the so-called Prado manuscript. You can also see here, get a sense of the physicality of the book and the way that the commentaries are bound into each of the two halves. So the first volume contains Capriccios 1 through 40, commentaries 1 through 40, and the second has the remaining ones. So with that introduction to the Boston set, here is Capriccio 43 from all 4 sets. And I'll talk about these briefly, and then I'll look at them in a little more detail. The second set you see next to the MFA set is from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. It was in the collection of Auguste Le Seuf, very important French bibliophile in the 19th century, had several hundred actually several thousand books that he donated to the National Library. It is bound, as you'll see, and it also has a set of commentaries. The set from the Art Gallery of Ontario was bound, and it was in the collection of William Sterling Maxwell. So it has an interesting provenance as well. Sterling Maxwell was an important early historian of Spanish art. The AGO set was bought by Norton Simon, and Norton Simon then sold it when he found a better set, which is the one that's now in the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena. Norton Simon sold it to a private collector in Canada who gave it to the AGO in 1999. It's unbound. It's been exhibited several times in Toronto and elsewhere. And then finally, the Norton Simon set in Pasadena, which had been bound, is now unbound. It also had a set of commentaries that accompanied it. So you get some sense, and we'll go into a little bit of detail here on each of these sets. Each of them has kind of an artistic personality, which is one of the things that I've been exploring and thinking about. What is the approach of an individual colorist across these 4 sets? The Bibliothèque Nationale and AGO sets have a lot of similarities, which suggest they could possibly have been done by the same colorist. You don't see that so much here, but you will in some other examples. But again, technical analysis would reveal more about that. Let's see. Okay, so before I go farther, I want to talk a little bit about hand coloring, what hand coloring is, its history, to provide a little bit more context. And I'll just start by saying that, surely the hand coloring of these sets of capriccios was inspired by the experience of other hand-colored prints. Hand-colored prints were very common in Europe, especially in 18th century and early 19th century Europe, and certainly a likely context were the English caricatures of James Gilray, Thomas Rowlandson, both 10 years Goya's junior. And I'm just showing you this example just to indicate that in the case of English caricatures, they could come colored or uncolored. And in England, there was a massive industry of coloring in the 18th century. It's kind of, it reached kind of almost mass-produced, a mass-produced kind of context, and some has been written about this, but there's surprisingly little. When I ask colleagues who work on English art, British art, to tell me about hand coloring and what can I learn from you to apply here, there's very, very, very little. There's a catalog from, I think it was the V&A in 1987, which is called Hand-Colored British Prints. Anthony Griffiths, who's one of the great authorities on printmaking, has written a chapter on hand-colored prints in his book was called Print Before Photography, massive catalog from a couple of years ago. But this largely remains an understudied field in general. Hand coloring, I should just say, refers to an image that was printed in monochrome ink, usually in black, and to which color was added, either at the time of creation or by a later hand. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of options. The artist, him or herself, can add color. Color can be added by the publisher. Color can be added at a later date. And so there's a whole range of possibilities. We do know in Goya's case, these were definitely colored, later on and probably in the early 19th century. The practice of hand coloring dates back to the 15th century and really begins during the era of woodblock printmaking, single sheet woodblock prints. In the 16th and 17th centuries, fine prints, in other words, engravings, were rarely colored. But the genres that end up being mostly colored, and this is true in Spain, as we'll see in a moment, tend to be scientific studies, where color adds detail to specimens from the natural world, subjects like zoology and botany, and also map making is a genre in which colored images are often made. And the last one, which I'll show you in a second, are images of fashion, and this emerges in the 18th century as well. I already mentioned the dramatic changes that take place in the second half of the 18th century, particularly in England, and particularly in relation to aquatint. Aquatint was usually the printmaking technique that was used to create the images in England that were then hand-colored. And so the fact that Goya is using aquatint is interesting, although I'll talk later about the ways in which Goya's use of aquatint really resists coloring. And in spite of that, these colorists forged ahead and did their best to color images that were really actually very hard to color. Because Goya, as you know, creates so much color himself through his use of multiple grains of aquatint bitten in various densities. Just to finish out this kind of very quick history, the era of hand coloring really ends in the 1830s with the rise of color lithography and new techniques for incorporating color directly into printmaking. So in Spain, just to show you quickly a couple of examples, hand coloring did exist in the 18th century. You can actually walk over to the Museo de Historia de Madrid and see examples like this one by Juan Bautista Bru, a very famous collection of representations of the natural world. Bru was an important official in the cabinet of natural history as an artist and also dissector. And the image on the right is actually a version of this is in the Prado, this image by Marcos Teis Villar. There are other versions as well. They're colored in different ways. So there was clearly choice being made by colorists as they thought about how to decorate these images. But again, these are the genres in which colored images existed in Spain, in this case, science and fashion. But also maps as well, and you can find many examples of that in the collection of the National Library. So now I want to move on and look at each of these sets just quickly, just to give you a flavor of what they're like and how they're different and what some of the general kind of similarities are, as well as we think about these as also a body of work. So here's a couple of details I took just last week at the National Library in Paris, showing you the binding of this book and the commentaries. And so it follows a lot of the conventions that we find in the early examples of the Caprichos. This is a fascinating volume because it shows evidence of the making of the work and the making of mistakes as the artist made the work. And so in the print on the left, example on the slide, you see this red blotch that corresponds, I'm not sure, I think maybe corresponds here. Clearly the artist closed the volume before the ink had, or the watercolor had dried. And so you start to imagine, the artist kind of flipping through page by page. I kind of imagine they were colored sequentially, starting with one, and then you finish the first one and do the second one, but we don't know that for sure. But to think about and imagine the practice of doing that. And then the image on the right is also fascinating, and I'd love to have some technical analysis of this. This is one of two places where unfortunately the colorist had a little bit of a problem and a mistake and things got spilled. And in this case, this is plate 30. Is it 30? 29, I can't remember, but it bleeds through to the next several images and bleeds through on this side as well. And there are two sequences where this unfortunately happened. Unlike the Boston set, the set in Paris is really very selectively colored, and often in a very beautiful way. In this case, you see the close range of tonalities that the artist is using to decorate the costumes, and some small details, but the background is left in the original aquatint that Goya created. The artist is preserving some of the qualities of light and dark in the original, but eliminating others. So this artist really focuses on figures, focuses on costumes, on skin tones, on selective details. There's also, at the same time as there's this close sense of tonality in some images, also a very beautiful palette. Looking here at plate 61, purples, pinks, yellows, reds, browns. The density of application varies, and you can see there's a sense of, the hand of the artist here, if you will, on this, the way the passages of this blue were put down, but really no modeling. There's not an attempt to create a three-dimensionality using paint. The artist is accepting in some ways, the radical flatness of Goya's images. And this is one of the things that has also become more apparent to me as I've studied these sets, and you'll see other cases where artists do use modeling. Something else which you can't see very well here is kind of a very beautiful sense of invention in some of these works. And so here, in the zone that I'm showing you on the ruffles of the sleeves, the artist is adding kind of red and pink tones, but not in a way that follows Goya's original etching, but kind of complements and interacts with it. And so creates this sense of pattern. And there's some other really amazing examples of that as well, which I'd show you if I had more time. Last example from this series. This also, I think, is kind of fascinating in terms of the reception and understanding of these works. The Paris example includes lots of cases of witchcraft where different figures are given different skin tones as a way of kind of differentiating between them. And then so in this case, you see the kind of the brown tonalities of the old witch and the kind of creamier tones of her young student. And so thinking about ways to enhance Goya's original design. So now I want to turn to the Art Gallery of Ontario set, and I mentioned the similarities with Paris, and this is just an example to make that point. You can see that both artists are really focusing on the same elements, on shoes, and I should say shoes are a focus throughout. The colorists all love shoes, and often pick up the shoes, which are an interesting element in many of Goya's prints, and then the elements along the belt, and then the straps, and a little bit of the gold decoration as well. And these works are actually more similar than they appear. One of the challenges is the difference in the photography here. And I should mention, we also owe the photography of these sets to Helmut Jacobs, who 2 or 3 years ago published a volume that illustrates all 4 of these sets. It's in German, and it's a really invaluable source. It doesn't really kind of analyze the practice the way that I'm interested in, but it provides an incredible resource for thinking about these works and a point of departure for investigating them. I should just quickly mention, going back to this image for a minute, all 4 of the sets indicate a really deep fascination in the scenes of witchcraft. This was clearly something that interested all of the colorists in various kinds of ways, and you'll see this in a remarkable way in the Boston set a little bit later. One additional image of the set in Toronto, just to show you another kind of technique or strategy present in this set as well as the others, and that is to pick out and highlight key details that are important for the narrative, if you will, that's told by these prints. And so adding a little blood to the sword, emphasizing the broken pot, which is the source of the punishment of the figure, drawing our attention to the book, that the man is clearly not reading because his eyes are closed. And so these are attentive viewers who are thinking carefully about how to think about and interact with Goya's image. And there's also coloring here, but it's hard to see, by the way, but skin tones are also colored in these cases, the pants, and some of that is lost in reproduction. But if you're familiar with English hand-colored prints of the 18th century, the example I showed and others, this is a very selective, very reductive, very tentative approach, really, to thinking about how to intervene with these images. So turning now to the last of the four sets, the Norton-Simon set, which is also a really fascinating one. It definitely has a particular personality, which I would describe as elegant. And if you look at the way in this first plate, the artist has transformed Goya's costume into this kind of outfit of a dandy with these kind of purple stripes and this pattern. You get a clear sense of that. Also added lots of color to the hat, made that into a kind of a solid shape. And another interesting thing, you'll see this in a couple of other examples, really thought about this frontispiece as a frontispiece, the way that the artist transforms Goya's very simple, it's actually a professional engraver, but the very simple engraved title into, this frontispiece, which is framed and, divided from the image of the artist. This is very typical of portrait engraving in the 18th century. And then the final thing I'll point out in this image, which is also really interesting, and it changes our experience of the print, is the Norton-Simon artist outlined the plates to create a really clear border around the edges. And you see that going on here, for example. The frontispieces are really interesting. Yeah, I'll talk about hair in a minute. Yeah, you're right, though. I'll have a great image for you, Manuela. This is the Boston frontispiece, and in this case, you can see how again, much more heavily worked treatment. I think only the cravat is not painted, and he's created this imitation of marbled paper. Using each of these artists done is they've used the plate mark as kind of the border in which to work in. And here, in fact, even created kind of a shadow, if you will. So it's as if this is a three-dimensional object that we're looking at. And the Boston image, I don't know, you'll have to decide for yourselves, but I think there's a humanization of the artist in the Boston image. There's a softening of the kind of satiric quality of the portrait, of the self-portrait, that's often seen as being characteristic of this first plate. Here we go, some hair. I mentioned elegance, a much higher key palette. You can see the addition of shadows on the legs, again, to kind of try to soften a little bit, and here on the side, and you realize just how flat Goya's treatment of the body is in this original print when you see the subtle ways in which this artist is slightly modifying that quality. But most significant is the addition of the hair. And this artist is fascinated with hair. Throughout the series, the Norton-Simon plates contain really interesting additions to the hair. And, they almost look like early 19th century hairstyles, in fact. And this is maybe an interesting question to examine as we think about when were these exactly made and what can that possibly reveal for us. And here's a detail where you see a little bit better the way in which, the cloth surrounding the figure has really been transformed into flowing hair, and the addition of the hair piece, the figure in the background, almost looks like a toupee. I have a couple more. Actually, one last Norton-Simon image, again, just to suggest the elegance. These smugglers look more like dandies than they do outlaws, in the costumes that this artist clothes them in. And there's so many interesting little choices made. One that I find fascinating is the choice to eliminate this small bit of white created by stopping out, just to create a more, I don't know, who knows, we could talk about what the reason is, but filling in that little element in an interesting kind of way, adding a little bit of decorative detail, some sort of rope around the materials on which this figure is sitting. Again, you can see modeling in the forms in interesting kinds of ways. And I'll use this as a segue back to the Boston set and show you the very different treatment of this image in that work. I think what's again, the most heavily worked set, much wider palette, much greater liberties with the image, as we'll see a little bit later. Complete elimination of that contrast between light and dark, which I had mentioned earlier. And I think the only parts of the plate that are not painted in the Boston image are maybe the sleeve, maybe these elements above the boots. But it's a very heavily worked image, including the background. And in fact, in many of the Boston plates, this use of blue and green really starts to imitate the way that English prints look during this period, and has the effect of smoothing out the gradation of the sky. You can see the tree has been given a much greater three-dimensionality. And so really what the artist has done is really made Goya's print into a little painting. And it's interesting to start to compare the Boston set to Goya's paintings, which isn't to suggest that the artist would have known or looked at Goya's paintings, but there are interesting commonalities between these. And this is an interesting comparison to me. The tapestry cartoon of the tobacco guards, bears a telling relationship, one that I think is more revealing once we see the Boston colored impression, and so calls our attention to this relationship. Even the structure of the tree and many other elements are incredibly close, and so maybe return us to connections we may have overlooked. The same is true in images like this one. When we compare the original print to the Boston set, and Goya is clearly turning it into a painting, and you see the sandy ground, the green background, the blue sky, which starts to seem to resemble portraits like this one. Again, I'm not suggesting the artist was going back and looking at this kind of image, but clearly thinking about painting when he was creating these images, and suggesting to us the relationship between Goya's portrait practice of the 1790s and this kind of image. And again, very selectively leaving elements uncolored, in this case the shawl, the glove, the fan, but really the rest of and also her ankles, but really the rest of the image is colored, and you can see the color bleeding into the margin in places as well. I think this is a good example, first of all, of that resistance of Goya's prints to coloring. And in spite of the fact that Goya has really heavily worked this plate with dark shades of aquatint, the artist nevertheless insists on coloring every single part of it. And again, this is a really interesting example of the augmentation, if you will, of materials, and the way in which the artist kind of creates this satiny effect, which may be hinted at in Goya's image, but is made much more apparent in this treatment. But more interesting, and this is where I'm going to move toward a conclusion, are the additions to the image that the artist has made. And I'm not sure exactly why in this case the artist did this, but the creation of this tree in the background, which builds on the suggestion of some sort of tree in the original print, but goes far beyond what Goya had done to create some sort of tree in the background. And that augmentation occurs in other places as well. But before I get there, I just want to... How am I doing on time? Should I be wrapping up? Because I can skip a couple things. Okay. So I wanted to return to the point I made earlier that Eleanor Sayer included this particular print in the Changing Image, an exhibition in 1974, which I think is the only time that this series has been exhibited. And first of all, you see, again, a point I've been making over and over again, and that is the elimination of light and dark and the replacement of that contrast with color. But Eleanor's point in her catalog entry is the way in which the colorist really understood, in her view, Goya's print, and emphasized the fact that the figure is naked, which you probably, it's probably true. You see that here a little bit, and yet he kind of emphasizes and underscores that point. And what's interesting is, now that I've had a chance to look at the other sets, they do something different. They actually put pants on this figure and deny the nakedness, which I think is a fascinating choice. And again, here's another example where you see that similarity between the set that's in Toronto and the one that is in Paris. Let me just also mention, I'll go back here for a second, just to mention, in terms of contemporary details, I mean, to me, this reminds me of the order of Charles III, the way in which the decoration has become more specific, and that's an interesting detail. If we think that might be true, that's an interesting detail which suggests a certain familiarity with Spanish costume, with the court, et cetera, et cetera. And then the Norton Simon artist does something even more interesting. And here's the Boston set, the naked set. Gives the figure pants and boots, kind of like a riding costume almost, if you will. Makes him look much more like a general in some ways. And again, brings to mind portraits of the time. And I think it's not surprising to think about an artist who's going to hand color works thinking about portrait conventions, not necessarily this particular portrait, which is in the Prado, but the kinds of conventions of Spanish portraits. And I think there are additional analyses to do looking at costume and the way the costumes are colored, which might provide us with insights into the context in which these colorists worked. The other interesting thing about the Norton Simon set is he adds these coattails. And so, one of the things that's fascinating to me about these images, and I think this might be a little bit different from British hand-colored images, is these artists are willing to interact with these works, not just simply follow the design, not just simply honor what they see as the artist's intention, but to, in some cases, transform that intention into something else. And that's what I want to conclude with by looking at two particular images from the Boston set where and I'll just do this very quickly, where clearly interesting things are happening. I'll just quickly point to them. In this case, the artist creates these two figures out of this figure. And so is literally painting over Goya's original scene, filling in this figure, and also the owl in the background. And one of the things that's interesting about examining these works is it makes apparent how, in some cases, in some places, how indefinite Goya's images are. There's a lot of suggestion and elements that aren't fully worked out. But when you sit down to have to color that image or to think about how you're going to add pigment to it, you have to make these choices and decisions and make things much more definite. I think color has that effect. I'll also mention, but I won't analyze, the way in which, in some ways, the colorist inverts the image by taking the focus off of this figure, who's highlighted, I think, in Goya's print, and puts the focus onto the victim. And again, I think a series of interesting choices take place there. I'll just quickly close by showing you this one. This is, I don't know if you know Maurice Sendak, but this always looks to me like something out of Maurice Sendak, this figure in the sky. What's the name of that I can't remember the name of the famous book. Where the Wild Things Are. That looks like something from Where the Wild Things... Anyway, that's a different kind of reference. But you can see this willingness to take Goya as a starting point and then expand on, invent something that almost looks a little bit like William Blake in terms of the tonalities and the colors and the way the forms exist. Obviously, the iconography is somewhat different, but there's an interesting connection there. And again, creating a much more defined and clearly articulated sense of space in the background through the differentiation of ground and sky. So just to return to the four sets, and to suggest that each of them then has this individual character, but I also think they cohere into a body of work that raises interesting questions that are iconographic, that are technical, that have to do with provenance and also with reception. And I'll just close by indicating some of the areas for further investigation. One is to think about the relation to the commentaries. Are the colorists thinking about manuscript commentaries and choices they make based on the commentaries? Can we learn things from the iconography, such as costume, which I mentioned, to possibly date the coloring? And most important, I think, is this analysis of the techniques of pigments and materials, which I think will yield us much interesting information. So with that, I think I'll conclude, and thank you very much.
I'm gonna turn the lights. Sure. Well, in case you want to use some image or...
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Bueno, thank you so much, both of you. Merci a vous les deux. No sé si en el público habrá alguna pregunta, pero bueno, me han venido muchas cosas a la cabeza. A lot of things came to my mind during both your talks. For instance, in Martial's talk, should I say it in English or French? Okay. So, for example, this, as most of you will know, in the album B of drawings of Goya, there is this big change. It starts, the beginning of this album starts with this kind of toilette scenes, quite not naive, but very delicate scenes of femininity and things, without any type of grotesque. And then we have this second part, which is completely, that has this strong caricatural element and deformation. And with this element of sound, since the disease, the deafness of Goya came around that time, I wonder if this change, well, of course, a lot of people have argued that it's linked to that. I don't know if it's necessarily true, because there is a, in European art, there is a big change, an aesthetic change with use of somatic deformation and all that. But do you think the way that he was looking at concerts and looking at musicians and this kind of dissonance could have changed after he was deaf?
Well, as I said, I'm not a specialist of Goya, and and secondly, I'm very afraid with the link that you can do between life and art. I think sometimes it's a little bit artificial. But of course, what I have observed is there is a significantly changing in this album B. I don't know if it is only concerning the sound, because I think all the senses are very important in Goya's universe. I mean, the touch, view, sight, and etc. But the fact is that the way in which he shows the sounds change at its very moment, at the same very moment. So maybe it's one part of the changing. Sounds is one part of the changing, but it concerns sounds too. Okay, I don't know.
Yeah, and perhaps being not having the possibility of actually hearing these sounds, he was looking more deeply into
to heavy sounds, to violence.
Ah, right. Yes,
to violence.
That's true.
And maybe he regrets the time when he was with the Osuna and with the classical music and the elegant sounds, you know, because he is not still able to hear them.
I have also a comment. So regarding like all these different versions of the color in all these sets, like I really wonder what are the criteria and whose initiative was it? Like, do you think it was an artist's own initiative, or it was a commission by a collector saying, let's say, like, black and white is not enough, it's a bit boring, I need a bit of color, and then an artist did it for him? Or
hard to know, but I think that kind of speculation is interesting to make. I don't really have I think there are multiple possibilities, and you named some of them. I don't really know what to speculate on that at this point. Yeah, but it's a very good question. It's one that's been on my mind and I've been thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah, because some interventions are more aggressive than others. Some are quite subtle.
Yeah.
And others.
I mean, you know, the Norton Simon set seems very much like the most, if you will, professional artist. So I think, I imagine the contexts were probably completely different. And so there's a certain danger in treating these four sets as kind of parallel in the sense that each of them was made in a similar context. It's interesting, the mistakes or the kind of accidents in the Paris set are also really interesting. And you know, there are cases where if you flip through the images, they're not all interesting. I kind of showed you the interesting ones. A lot of them, there's like a cuff here, or it's even sometimes hard to tell what's colored. And in fact, before I saw them in person, there were some plates that I thought weren't colored at all. But for example, Porque fue sensible, the image entirely in aquatint of the woman in prison. I can't remember. One of the sets just has this very faint sense of maybe a beginning or end of the day through the window, of the bars. And so I think, one thing I have kind of wondered about, aside from the Boston artist who is like, he's completely willing to take over the image and color the entire thing. There seems to be this, I guess I would say tentative approach in some cases, faced with the kind of, not only the challenges of aquatint that I mentioned, where some of Goya's very dense images seem to resist color altogether, but also a kind of maybe a respect for the image, if you will. and a desire to, think about the three images I showed from Toronto, where the artist is just coloring a certain detail, which does in a way augment or underscore the image, and I think those are really interesting kind of choices. So I think even within a given set, there's a whole range of approaches depending on the image. But in terms of what we know about who made these images, I would say clearly they're not professional colorists. The quality of the images kind of makes that clear, maybe with the exception of the Norton Simon set. So could even be owners of the prints, amateurs deciding that they wanted to add color. So I think these are questions that are hard to answer at this point, and maybe will never be answerable. But I think it's interesting. I think there are clues that allow us to think about how to provide some provisional answers. Yeah.
But you talk about both colorists as artists, but
right.
Do you think that there is a practice of amateur?
Yeah, I do. I mean, probably I should use the term artist guardedly. Maybe colorist is a better word. The person who adds the color. I don't. I think. On the other hand, even as amateurs, those works are. It's hard to control watercolor. On a piece of paper. Yeah. And again, thinking about it's a bound book. You're trying to keep it open, and maybe it has some wrinkles in it. I mean,
we saw some blots.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Yeah. So it clearly was closed, and the color went from one page to the next. Oh, Janice has the microphone.
Thank you for the talks. Thank you for both presentations. Very interesting. I do have a question, Andy. You keep referring to the artist as a he.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And we all know that young ladies learned watercolor as part of their upbringing.
Right.
So I would question that. And I was wondering if there's been any literature on that as far as the people. I thought I had read something about people who hand-colored prints.
Yes.
Women did do that.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if we began thinking of the artists as female, would that change in any way how you're thinking about these?
Yeah. So certainly, just to start with the question about the larger kind of history of hand coloring, certainly in 18th century Britain, it seems to have been an industry in which a lot of women worked. Janice, you're right about that. Although again, it's hard to. There's not a lot of evidence because it was such a, I guess you would say, menial practice that it wasn't really recorded in detail. Not a lot written about it, but I completely take your point, and I think it's one worth considering. Yeah. Thanks for that suggestion. Yeah.
I have a question about the dating.
Yeah.
The date.
About the dating, you were saying before that you didn't know how to date the prints. There is one, the one that I can't remember the title of the Capriccio, but it is the one that has a lot of color on the right. It was on the right, and he has the hair added, and she has the hair added too. And I think that. Well, they have that's not the.
No, I'm going to find it for you.
Yeah, the lady or the woman who is there, the young woman who is there.
Is this the one?
I think that's the one. No, but it's complete.
No, not this.
No, or maybe it's another one similar. No, that's the one I think.
You think so?
Yeah, I think that they have altered also a little bit the face of the woman.
Yeah,
it has been altered.
Yeah.
And I think that it looks to me like, I don't know why, 18, quite early, but between 1815 and 1820.
Yeah.
That's how I feel it is.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that the Capriccios were really quite retired from the selling, and probably they were bought a little bit more when the French were in Spain or the English army was in Spain. Maybe it is just then when they bought it in Spain, maybe, and then
I think you're probably. I
studied.
think that makes a lot of sense.
Because that one seems to me 18,
Yeah, no.
16, 17.
And the man's hair too
And
seems
the
like
men's
that,
hair
right?
with this,
Yeah.
and that.
Yeah. So, yeah, I didn't
Not
really have
always.
time to talk about this, but there's a lot of modeling on the women's faces
Yeah.
throughout most of the series. I mean, you saw that a little bit also maybe in.
Yeah, because the faces of women in Goya are very
here
determined.
also. Yeah.
And so they don't like it or something, or they prefer. Yeah, that's also very interesting.
And you can see how flat the original is. Like
Yeah.
there's very little sense of dimension to the face.
Very good.
And the artist uses that as there's kind of an opportunity for the artist to add that three-dimensionality. But
Yeah.
lots of the figures have like blush on their cheeks and other kinds of alterations. Sometimes the eyes are
Yeah.
emphasized.
Because I don't see that they will be doing this at the end of the 19th century.
No. I'm sure it's earlier than that. I just don't
Okay,
have a.
yeah.
It's good to hear your sense of this
I
because
think
this
so.
is kind of what I've been thinking.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
thank you for your thing. I don't think I have any other question,
Thank
but for
you.
you, I have something which doesn't have anything to do with Goya, but you were showing two prints. I think they were the Dutch prints, where they're all at the table and halfway, and they're looking at and eating and drinking like crazy. And I was interested in two of the figures, which are almost the same in both prints, which are very different by other people. But, before that one, before the one before, two before, one more, this one here, that one, and then there is another one which is very similar to this, which I think it was a little bit later. The same people. Yeah, also this one, more or less. The previous one is the best one, for what I want to say, and it's 17th century, these prints, this. And I think that the two people on the right, they're Jewish. I mean, there's a representation of Jewish people. And do you have an explanation for that, or it's nothing to do with Goya, but I mean, I'm interested in it.
Judge?
No, not interested in Jewish, but Jewish.
Yes, of course.
The noses are.
Course.
And is it a different type of dresses that coincide with the Jewish people? But because the one on the left are not.
No.
And they're probably laughing at the other one on the right. Is that true? It's very interesting.
It could, because we have always those kind of typology in German, French, and septentrional.
Also in
prints.
Spain now there is an exhibition in the Prado.
Spain, I don't know. But,
Well, no, but there is an exhibition in the Prado which just opened, and I haven't seen it yet, which is the representation of
and
Jewish
of course,
people in Spain.
you know, with the ham, with the hamon.
The ham, yeah. And they have ham.
It's a taboo.
So I think they're just laughing at each other, saying we eat ham, and
everything.
the others one don't eat.
Yes.
That is interesting. Anyway, thank you so much. It was very interesting.
Maybe, sorry, just one more idea. Of course, those faces are very similar to the grotesque tradition from grotesque head of Leonardo da Vinci and Wenzel's Hola that we saw this morning, the first speech.
First, I just want to thank you both for those really interesting talks. And I think one of the interesting things about Goya's later work, and especially his drawings and prints, is how noisy they can be, how much sound there seems to be to them. So I really appreciated you drawing that out a bit in a particular and interesting way. And Andrew, I wanted to pick up on Janice's point about who may have colored these prints, and it's kind of a silly idea, but it came to my mind, so if it came to my mind, I'm just going to share it. And I was wondering, especially looking at the set that's kind of messy, with the blotch and the spills.
Yeah, bought in Paris. Yeah.
Could a child maybe have made
Possibly.
these? You know, treating it almost like a coloring book type of thing. And I also, what else made me think of that? Oh, yes, the print that Manuela was interested in, Asiento. The adding of the hair to make it up to date. So this is going to sound silly, but it reminded me something that I did when I was young with my dolls. So I had a Barbie doll and a Ken doll, and the Ken was really getting out of fashion, and I had to give him sideburns. So I took the magic marker and I drew in the sideburns, thus ruining the doll. But I'm wondering if something similar isn't happening here. So just throwing that out, just something to think about.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. I would like to ask to Andrew for sure, have you checked that all of them are first edition?
Yes.
Okay. And I think it was Thomas Harris that said that in the first edition there was two groups and there was a scratch in one of the plates.
Plate 40.
Okay.
Plate 45.
And are they part of the first group or the second group?
Yeah. So it's interesting you should ask that because I was wondering that the other day. I think the Paris set is before the scratch. I think the others are after.
So there is just one before the scratch?
I believe so. I'll check on that and make sure, yeah.
And there is no clue about the Spanish provenance of these sets?
No.
No clue. Okay.
Yeah.
It's very interesting, but we have no information.
I know. I'd love to talk, Jose, I was thinking I'd love to talk with you more about this, this topic. Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Let me just quickly say that, just in case people don't know, plate 45 is one of the places where, as you were suggesting, we kind of know how early in the first edition the print was, because there's this accidental scratch that ends up running through the nose of one of the figures, and that's kind of a clue that maybe Thomas Harris came up with that. I don't know who first discovered that, but you're familiar with it. Yeah. It's 45, I think it's 45, yeah. Okay.
Bueno, pues si no hay más preguntas por parte del público, podemos dar por zanjada la primera jornada del Seminario Goya grotesco coleccionismo y mañana por la mañana continuamos a partir de las 10:30. Muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí.